Greiner Talks, about sustainability and transformation. A Greiner podcast episode.
How to create a sustainable future. How to change. That's what we are discussing here. My name is Alexander. I'm part of the sustainability team at Greiner. In this episode, I will be speaking to an incredible thought leader on disability rights and inclusion. From the South African Human Rights Commission to leading the US government's efforts in inclusive development, her career is more than impressive. Currently, she serves as Global Disability Advisor at the World Bank. Welcome, Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo.
Hi, Alexander. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you for this podcast today.
Charlotte, I'm incredibly excited. I've just watched your TEDx talk on YouTube and you are here with me right now. Where are you? How's your day?
So today I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm at the headquarters of the World Bank, which are located downtown in Washington, D.C. I'm in my office and it's an early, crispy morning here in Washington.
You are sitting in the US right now, but actually that's not your origin. Where are you from?
So I'm originally a South African American. I have one parent that's American and one parent that's South African. So I straddle the two.
I think when speaking to you about human rights, about disability inclusion, it's really essential to know your story. And there's so many dimensions to your story. Would you like to share one or two topics that are close to your heart? And would you like to share bits and pieces of your story at least?
Sure. So, I was born during the apartheid era in South Africa. I didn't actually live in South Africa. And the reason I didn't was because my parents are mixed. My father's white American and my mother's Xhosa, black. And they couldn't live in South Africa at the time because there was legislation that prohibited marriage across color lines. And so we lived in countries around South Africa. We lived in Zambia, Tanzania, Swaziland, Lesotho. But, my proximity to South Africa and my parents' commitment to the struggle against apartheid was a huge factor in raising my consciousness about justice and inequality. And as a child, I lived either on university campuses or close to university campuses. And I read voraciously. I was a very inquisitive child. I wanted to know what was going on in the world. And so I listened to my parents. I listened to their friends talking. And often the conversation was about the injustices of apartheid. And so at an early age, I knew that I wanted to do something. I wanted to address the situation of inequality and contribute to making the world a better place. My dad was a law professor, and that had a huge influence on my decision to study law.
So your upbringing, your childhood, your cultural surrounding played an incredibly important role in what you're doing today.
It certainly did. And, it put me on that pathway to doing what I do today. It made me very aware about my own privilege as a middle-class kid and recognizing that there were many people that did not have what I had. And so I thought about that from a very early age and wanted to study something that would make the change. And I figured law and human rights law in particular would be that thing to make the change.
And then there's even another incredibly important dimension to your story. Would you like to share that as well with us?
Yeah, so I went on to study law. And then after I had graduated from law school, I was involved in a very serious car crash. And that car crash resulted in me becoming disabled. So I was hospitalized for many, many, many months and have permanently disabled, and I use a wheelchair. And you can imagine that was a very traumatic time in my life. I had to basically relearn my body and how to navigate the world. And so that was difficult. But I have to say, it never diminished my passion for social justice. If anything, it made it stronger. And I think it made it stronger because I was even more acutely aware about discrimination and injustices.
Thank you for sharing that story, Charlotte. And I have mentioned in the very beginning of the interview that you are currently working as the Global Disability Advisor at the World Bank. Of course, that is very much connected to your personal story. Could you explain briefly what does your job involve and what are you actually doing at the World Bank?
So My job is to advance disability inclusion within the World Bank Group. And I've structured it around 3 pillars. The one pillar is to provide technical assistance to World Bank staff on disability inclusion and push for impact. And this is across sectors. So within infrastructure, within education, with health, digital, social protection, and so forth. So there's that part, the technical assistance. The second part is to lead knowledge, provide technical guidance, and very importantly, to generate new research and data on disability, both at a global level, regional level, and very much at a country level. And then the third area is forging partnerships and advocacy to promote disability inclusion within the institution, so within the bank itself, but also externally. I'm profoundly aware that as an institution, we don't have the monopoly on knowledge on disability inclusion. And I recognize the importance of ensuring that we engage and listen to persons with disabilities to understand their lived experiences and see how we can assist in affecting change at scale, change that is both inclusive and sustainable.
And could you share with us, what is the World Bank doing to improve livelihoods of people with disabilities? And maybe for listeners who are not so familiar with the World Bank, would you also like to briefly share the overall mission of the World Bank?
Yeah, so let me start with your second question first. So the World Bank is one of the largest sources of funding and knowledge for developing countries. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have 5 institutions that are committed to reducing poverty, increasing shared prosperity, and promoting sustainable development. We provide financing, we provide policy advice and technical assistance to governments. So we work primarily with governments of developing countries. Our overall vision is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And I think that's something I want to stress, right? On a livable planet. The work at the bank is complex, as you can imagine. It is very dynamic. But I think, seeing the direct impact of your work and on our investments can be extremely gratifying. So you asked me, what are some of the things that I do? I'll give you an example of an initiative that I manage called the Inclusive Education Initiative. And this initiative supports children with disabilities to enable them to access education. And so we've supported a number of projects to address the education of children with disabilities. But beyond the education space, we have projects that are ensuring accessible transportation. If you don't have accessible transportation in a city and you're a person with a disability, you can't get to work, you can't get to school, you can't get to college. So transportation is very important. You can't get to healthcare services. So having accessible transport is really important. And so there are many of these areas where we've seen the bank pushing and advising on disability inclusion, and seeing how that impacts on individuals at country level for me is extremely gratifying.
And from my research, I know that poverty and disability inclusion is also very much connected. Could you give me an insight here?
So yes, absolutely. I think the research tells us that there's an interconnectedness between poverty and disability. And if you think about it, often persons with disabilities are unable or excluded from employment, which means households then are poorer. There are also a lot of hidden costs that are associated with a disability. And I'll just take myself, for example. I use a wheelchair. And so there are costs associated with that. If I didn't have a job that covers my medical coverage, that would have to be an out-pocket cost that I would need to take on. And so we see that households that have children with disabilities, have a member with a disability, are often poorer than households that don't. And it may also be that the level of education is lower, not because the person with the disability can't learn, but because systems are built to exclude them from learning.
And we are speaking about disabilities, but what I have learned is that there's many different forms of disability, and they can be very different and have very different impacts and implications. What is your thought here?
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think we need to think about disability as a spectrum, right? And you're correct in saying there are many different types of disabilities. And what we typically do is we focus on the disabilities that we can see, so the visible disabilities. And yet there's a whole range of invisible disabilities. And we often don't think about that. And it's very important for us, if we're going to address disability inclusion, to absolutely address the issues related to the visible disabilities, but also very much those that are invisible. And just here, Alexandra, I'd like to say that we're not talking about a small population, right? We're talking about at least 15 to 18% of the world's population have a disability. And we actually know that this number is quite a conservative number. And it's conservative because typically there's underreporting of disability, and that's linked to stigma, lack of access to services. Then there's an undercounting. We see constant natural disasters that are creating disability. And sadly, the issue around war and conflict continue to contribute to disability. So this number is only growing, it's not diminishing.
You have also mentioned research and data. Is there anything in your research, in the findings of the World Bank, that particularly surprised you?
Is there anything that particularly surprised me? I'm not sure that it surprised me, but I think the value of the research and the data is that it affirms what you're thinking, right? So having the numbers that show us how many children are out of school with disabilities is a very important and significant advancement. As an institution that focuses on data, having that kind of data is really very important. The other thing that perhaps may surprise me a bit is how embedded disability discrimination is. Embedded in cultural norms, embedded in societal beliefs, and just embedded in the way we think about people who are different from us. And it doesn't matter where you go in the world, you hear that. There still remains a lot of stigma and discrimination against persons with disabilities.
Speaking of social norms, of cultural norms, you are now for more than 9 years at the World Bank. You're trying to advance disability inclusion there. What are some of the biggest learnings or the biggest challenges you have faced in this career? Is there anything you would like to share with us?
Yeah, so I think some of the biggest challenges relate to an earlier point, and that is, how do we have a really strong storyline, a narrative that is evidence-based, built on data, and can be used to influence government decisions on where they're going to put their money, right? So you need to have the numbers that help you then make the case. So data, and more data. That's a really important piece. The second piece that I think is a challenge is that we need a critical mass of people that understand disability inclusion. It cannot just be the disability advisor and her team. It has to be everybody's business to address disability, but also other aspects of diversity, right? It has to be everybody's business. And then I think the other issue that I think is concerning is that there are lots of competing interests in the space of development. And how do we make sure that disability continues to be an area of critical investment and focus? And how do we ensure that this isn't the agenda that gets dropped off?
Charlotte, changing political systems, changing frame conditions, that's something that goes like a red thread through your entire career. Before you joined the World Bank, you worked for USAID, where President Barack Obama appointed you to lead the government's efforts in inclusive development. Nelson Mandela appointed you to the South African Human Rights Commission. You worked with children's rights at UNICEF. I'm wondering, how has the world changed in terms of human rights since, let's say, the 1990s? Has the situation improved?
Look, so that's a really big question. And, yes, I think the world has changed for sure. But I also want to say that I think throughout my career, what I have done is to really follow my passion. And in terms of the changing, what I see is definitely a much greater legal recognition of disability rights And that's in part because of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I was really fortunate to have been part of that journey. At the time, I was with the South African Human Rights Commission, and I participated in the intergovernmental treaty negotiations on developing the convention. And today, it's been ratified by 183 countries, which makes it close to universal and really makes it quite remarkable. So we definitely see that the architecture, the international architecture, is in place to support disability rights, which is very different from the 90s. But I also think that we see much stronger organizations of persons with disabilities. They're better capacitated, they're better organized. You know, I've been talking about data. We're beginning to see better data. I think we're seeing more role models with disabilities. We're beginning to see more positive representation of persons with disabilities. Certainly more legal protection, more awareness around accessibility. And so I would argue that the narrative around disability rights has changed significantly. But I'll also be the first person to come back and say that we cannot for a minute allow these gains to be presented as sufficient, because they're not. We need to ensure that no person with a disability, visible or invisible, is discriminated against because of their disability or excluded from accessing education, employment, health care services. And we absolutely have to insist that these rights that are now in place do not become paper rights, but are in fact implemented and impact and change the lives of persons with disabilities for the better.
Some barriers only exist in our minds on a very personal level. Do you have any advice for people without disabilities to better communicate, to better collaborate with people with disabilities?
So look, I mean, I think the one thing, empathy. So empathy is a really important piece. I think being respectful is essential. Becoming an ally is very important. But to do that, you need to educate yourself about disability. You need to read, you need to take a class, join an organization, figure it out. You can ask questions, ask a friend. And I mean, I always say, just never make assumptions. And let's remember that, you know, diversity is our strength, and that we all have a collective responsibility to make sure that we live in a world where we leave no one behind.
Never making any assumptions. That's one of the things that I'll definitely take away from this interview with me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alexander.
We're slowly coming to an end, Charlotte, but before I let you go, I'd love to invite you to do a short word rap with me. So I would give you one word, one term, and you can reply with whatever comes to your mind.
Let's go.
First one, respect.
Empathy.
Exclusion.
Inclusion.
Social norms.
Social practice.
Your favorite dish?
Beans.
Childhood.
Happy.
And last but not least, your message to the world?
Leave no one behind.
Thank you for that very positive last message. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for joining Greiner Talks.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this.
And thank you everybody for listening. Please make sure to go on YouTube, search for Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, watch her TEDx talk at George Washington University, educate yourself, and have a nice day.
Greiner Talks, a Greiner podcast. Subscribe now.